All right, so hi everyone. I'm Tom. I will feel a bit weird saying this, but my company is also recruiting. Uh, can I say this? Okay, cool. I work for I work for Spark Solutions. Not I started very recently, but I think it's a pretty good company already, and they are recruiting. So front-end developers, Ruby developers. So um, if you're interested in that, then maybe that will be um, your next company to work in. I highly recommend them so far. So today I will be talking about something that's been kind of changing rapidly, I would say, in the last. Well, React isn't that old, but has been changing quite a bit recently in the world of React, and that is how to deal with cross-cutting concerns. Um, so currently we have, I think, three major approaches to this, and what Facebook recommends nowadays has changed since React was created first. So what I'll do for you today, um, I will discuss what kind of cross-cutting concerns you might be dealing with if you're developing, well, React websites, but really cross-cutting concerns can occur anywhere if you're coding anything. Um, and we'll go through different approaches to implementing cross-cutting concerns so that you create manageable code that works fast and um, is kind of predictable in a way. That's actually the reason why these changes happened because Facebook is using React and they have noticed certain things um, about how their developers worked so far with React, and that's why they made the change, and that's why they are recommending something else now. This will be a mostly practical presentation, so I'll be coding live for you. So, and I'll be using a online editor. So these aren't that great with recognizing the mistakes. So if I'm stuck at something and I can't find a missing colon or something similar, please let me know. So we can move on a bit faster, so we don't get stuck on something trivial. All right. So let's start the presentation. So, what are cross-cutting concerns? And so, if you have, let's say, a car, for example, you can switch the wheels to some other types, or you can give it a spoiler. But you can combine these things and change the car the way you like. But these things can also be applied to other cars, and you can mix and match however you like. And cross-cutting concerns are kind of like that as well. These are things that can work with multiple different components. If we're in talking about the React world, and it makes sense to externalize them, use them to remove duplication in your components, move them outside of them, and then have those components reference them instead. That way, they are much more manageable. And what is also important, when you're building even a bit more complicated application, it quickly starts to become apparent that you will have many cross-cutting concerns. Because if you communicate with a backend server, for example, because it exposes some kind of API, you might want, that will be a cross-cutting concern usually, because that API will expose different methods, and maybe one component will be a emblem that will display the logged in user's photo, and you want to get it from the backend. Maybe another will display the list of posts that the user created. So you can have multiple components communicating with that backend, and it's a good idea to have that backend separated into a different place outside of those components. It's just a single place, instead of having that component implemented all over the place in different components. A lot of the interaction things, if you're reacting inside of your components to something that happens on the website visually, that will often also be a place where cross-cutting concerns occur. And if you use Redux or some other library for controlling state in React, if you have a larger app, that's also a cross-cutting concern, because that state spreads out throughout the components, and you want it to be convenient for the website to be for the whole website to get the information from that state. So it's not very specific to a single component, but it's more like every component needs something from that state. And so what what kind of cross-cutting concern I'll be implementing today is an extension to components that allows them to recognize how much room they have for themselves. And they will react to the amount of room that's available and adjust their style accordingly. So this will be the end result. There will be two components on the page, a header and a message component. And as you can see, when there is enough room for the header will expand, and when there is enough room for the message will turn into a 3-column layout. But they change at different moments. So they both need the same kind of functionality, but they implement it a bit differently. So they adjust however they want to it. So the original approach to using cross-cutting concerns was using Mixins in React, and it's still supported even now, even though Facebook is not recommending it and is slowly removing support in its own tools for it. You can still use Mixins in React. You just need to import a library that extends React, and then you can still use it. So not technically deprecated is what the Facebook's documentation says about Mixins. And they will allow us to add that the functionality for us to recognize how much room a component has. So this is the first thing that we'll do. We'll use Mixins to intelligently separate the functionality of recognizing if the component is wide or not. So I'm starting with an almost blank project. I have a single div on the page that I will attach React to, and then I also created a set of styles for the header and for the message that you saw earlier, so that we don't have to spend time doing it right now. So I can minimize the CSS window, but we'll leave the HTML and JS windows open. And so I want to create two components on the website. So let's start with the header component. And I will use the old JavaScript syntax, not the ES6 classes syntax, but the old React.createClass syntax. Because with this syntax, I can actually use Mixins. I can't use Mixins with the new one. That's actually one of the reasons why Mixins are no longer supported, because you have to use the old syntax. So let's create a header real quick. And I have to attach, well, let's create some kind of container component for the header and for the message. So again, create class, render, and here I'll have some containing div, and I'll put the header inside of it. And I still have to attach React to the page, which I'll do with React DOM. The first argument for the render method is the main component, and then I'll have to find root on the page, which has the ID root. So get element by ID. Okay, so we have the header, but as you can see, if I resize it, well, nothing happens, and we still want it to kind of react to the space that it has available. So what I'll do, I'll provide a simple implementation inside of the header that will allow it to recognize the room it has available. So I'll just attach to the window and listen to the resize event of the window to know to check how much space is available whenever the width of the page changes. So that's window, add event listener, size. And let's say I'll simplify it a little bit. I'll just change how the header looks if there's a lot of room or there's little room. So just two different states. So this is how you would set this state in the old way that you wrote React components. Let's call this property as wide, and let's set it to null, because at the beginning we don't know if the component is wide or not. We'll also need to let's first complete implementing the onWindow resize function. So let's say if the component is more than 600 pixels wide, then we'll say that it's wide. Otherwise, it won't be wide. And to get the width of the component, we'll use React DOM's find DOM node. I believe we can use this here. I'll try that. And the width is under offset width. So this method will be run every time the window is resized. So we also want to run it when the component appears on the website the first time to check what its initial state is. So we just run onWindow resize, immediately after the component is placed on the page. And we still need to somehow use this isWhite property. So we have the header tag here, so we'll add a class. So if the component is wide, we'll add a CSS class to it called wide. I've already created it in CSS, so we should see a different kind of style for the header if it's wide. Right, so the header now changed, and if we go down with the width of the page, then you can see that it gets smaller, right? So now let's add the other component, which is the message, which will be very similar actually. So let's just copy most of the code. The difference will be that this component also displays some text. So let's first adjust this this new component to actually display a message box like this. The class, the CSS class for this component is just message, and we'll also need a wide CSS class added to it if there's more room available for it to be displayed. Plus, it needs some text. So we'll add some text. Actually, let's just provide the text in a prop. So let's go with props, children, and then when we add, I just put some spacing between the header and message. When we add the message component, we'll put in the text that we want it to display. So we'll put it right here. Okay, it's almost okay. It's lacking some style. Oh, okay, so we need clauses around this one. Okay, so now we have the styled message component. As you can see, it is now visible in 3 columns. If we decrease the width, it's just a single column. But we have a lot of repetition here. So almost the whole component, both components are so simple that most of what we've written inside of both of them is actually the same code. So if we added another component on the page, we would have to copy that code again, and if we had another one, we would have to copy the same code again, and then maintaining that all of those copies would be a nightmare. So let's be smarter about it, and let's create a mixin that will encapsulate that functionality for us. Because there's nothing in recognizing the width of a component that's specific to the message or the header or any other component, so we can quite easily do that. So let's do that right now. Let's create let's call it a resizable mixin. And mixins in React can have the same lifecycle methods as any React component. So you can have component did mount, component will unmount, and other lifecycle methods, and they will be called when the mixin is added to a component. So that's very nice, because the component can react to whatever the mixin can react to whatever the component reacts to. So we'll just copy most of what we've created in those header and message components. All of this can go to the mixin. And to have that mixin applied to a component, we use a special field when creating a component called Mixins, and we add all the mixins we want. So we call that mixin resizable. So we put it in the array containing all our mixins for the header component, and we'll do the same for our message component. Right, so let's see if it works still. Oh. Let's play around with it again, and it still works. So we removed the duplication that we had, and so now it's much easier to manage this code. If we wanted to somehow change it, like for example we wanted to change when the switch happens between the state of the component being a treated as a wide component or a narrow component, then we just do it in a single place. But there are some issues to Mixins. One I already mentioned, and that is you can't put this Mixins property when you're writing something like class message extends React component, which is the new way of creating components in React. It's the ES6 way of creating classes, and Facebook decided to use it for their components. And you can't use Mixins with those. So that's one thing. It would be kind of weird and inconvenient to use Mixins with that new format. And another thing is that Mixins were never perfect for managing cross-cutting concerns. And Facebook, well, they have very big code bases, and when people worked on them, it turned out that they were afraid of changing some components because they had a lot of mixins added that made it very difficult to figure out how the component worked. Plus, there's a lot of implicit stuff going on when you add components to when you add mixins to a component, because it's like a flat hierarchy. So I could have another mixin apart from resizable added to, let's say, the header, and then another one, but they would all together merge into a single component, and it's difficult then to figure out where a piece of functionality came from. Did it come from the component? Did it come from one of the mixins? It's tough, especially if you have many mixins. Plus, mixins overlap. So if, for example, I had another mixin, and that mixin had a on-window resize method, one of these on-window resize methods would overlap the other, and this can produce very difficult to debug situations. So it's like we did develop applications using mixins, but hoping that there would be no collisions. And Facebook came to the conclusion that this is too risky for them to keep using. So the next step after this is the recent way of using of adding functionality that is useful to multiple components, and that is called higher order components. And this is actually not any new kind of mechanism or some extra library on top of React. It's actually a component on top of another component. So React, even without Mixins, is expressive enough. The tool is expressive enough that we can still have most of the functionality that Mixins offered, but without using Mixins, just composing components together. So let's modify this example and use higher order components instead of Mixins. So what I'll do first is switch to ES6 classes, because that's the way to go if you're developing new components in React. So instead of React create class, we'll have class header extends React.component. We can't use Mixins, so they're out. We still want to know if we still want some kind of isWide property to know how to display the component. So what we'll do, we'll get this isWide property from the higher order function. So it won't be from the state, but from a different component that will send it into the props object into the header component. And let's do the same with the message component. Remove Mixins. Have props here. And instead of resizable Mixin, we'll have a resizable component. So it has to be a bit different than just a component. So we'll have a function that actually wraps our original component into functionality that we need. So we'll stick with resizable, but this will be a function. And here I'll have, let's call it a provider component. It's actually a class. And it will have most of the functionality that we already wrote. So I'll just move it over to into the class, except we don't need any commas here, as this is a class. This is almost okay, except we'll send the original component to the function so we can wrap it with extra functionality. And this higher order component will actually render the original component, except that original component will get that extra isWide property to use to display differently based on the width of that is available for him. So what we'll do, so here we're just rendering I have to remember how to write it, but okay. So this extra higher order component will return the original component, but it will give it an extra property that it can use internally.
So return and double return.
Right. Good catch.
You need to return the class provider.
Yes. So now I think everything is fine. Okay. So now when we have this wrapper, we will wrap the original component. Actually, it's a bit more than this. It's this with this extra functionality, and we'll wrap both of these components. So this one and this one, we're taking the SY property.
And you have extra parents around the classes, header and message.
Right, because we switched from React create class, React create class to ES6 classes
And message.
And message, yes. But it's still not displaying.
Well, what you have is a body.
Shutdown. Oops. So we have to change quite a bit actually if we're moving to ES6 classes. What else? Component mount. I think we also have to do this.
I would try to return the class directly. Instead of return provider, move the return class.
Not sure, we can. Here?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't know?
Not really. I'm afraid there's still something missing here. My component.
It's live coding.
Yeah. We'll figure it out.
Probably we need to return a new instance inside the resizable function. I mean, when you call resizable function, it should render it inside. Probably it makes sense to return. No, not here. I mean, inside the resizable function, return new provider.
Here?
No, actually I think what you have to do is assign resizable to a const and use the const with angle brackets. Because right now what resizable returns is a class.
Right, okay.
And it doesn't know it's JSX,
Yes.
I think.
So we'll make it a bit clearer, and I'll call the new components resizable header and then resizable message. So we're implementing the original components right here. Resizable message. Okay. So this was missing, and here we'll just use the new components that we created. Resizable message. Okay, we're almost done. We're missing one thing, and that is because we wrapped the original component in the new one, the props don't get sent over. And one of the props that we need for the message is actually children, which will contain this text that gets sent to the resizable message. So we need to send that over, and I'll use the spread syntax to to just copy over all the props that the original component needed. And I'll have to do it here. Right. So let's check if this works. Okay, so the header gets smaller. We switch to a single column. Everything still works. So this is the new and recommended way of dealing with cross-cutting concerns. So we created an extra component that can wrap around other components and provide extra functionality. While this is better because it uses ES6, we don't need that extra Mixins key in our components to add that extra functionality. And the cool part is that you can combine more cross-cutting concerns into a component. If you just you can have a resizable header, and then you can put a resizable header inside another component that adds something more than the is-wide property to it, and then another one and another one, and keep extending the original component as much as you like. But there are still some limitations, and some of them similar to the original approach with Mixins. One thing that is important is that this extra functionality is kind of implied. If you look at the header component and the message component, you'll see that yes, we're using the props is wide, but it's kind of while looking at this, it's kind of difficult to figure out where it came from. And this, right now, we have a rather simple example, but if we added more higher order components that would wrap the header and the message, and we did it a couple of times, it would be difficult to figure out where is wide came from which one. And so this is a similar issue that we had with Mixins. So when the website gets more complicated, it's difficult to figure out what's going on. And still clobbering can occur. So if there was another higher order component that would wrap this header component that we have here, and that higher order component provided a is-wide property as well, then it would replace the is-wide property provided by a resizable header. So we would be replacing some functionality, and it would be difficult to debug. Okay, so the last approach I wanted to show you is render props. And this is an alternative to higher order components. It's also recent, even more recent, I would say, than higher order components. And now it's officially visible in the documentation as well. So it's another sort of alternative way of providing that cross-cutting functionality to components. We're kind of short on time, so let me just look. I actually created these examples a bit earlier, so let's, instead of rewriting the whole thing, let's look at how that example that we created so far would look if we used, instead of higher order components or mixins, if we used render props. I'll make this a bit bigger so you can see how render props work. So we still have some kind of main component with render props that puts everything together, and we have our is-wide property here that we use, but now the extra functionality is added right here. So instead of extending the class itself, we dynamically extend the component in its render method. So now, as you can see, it's very explicit that the resizable component provides the is-wide variable for us to use, and then we just use it. So if we wanted to add more functionality, we could wrap the resizable component in another component, and it would be very easy to see what gets provided from which extra component. So this is a big advantage of render props over higher order components. And also, higher order components may be easier to use in some circumstances because they're dynamic. That means they're a bit slower. If performance is the most important thing for you, then higher order components are faster. But render props in some situations can allow you to do things that you can't do with render props because they're dynamic. And so it's still a component that wraps around the original, that uses the original component, but instead of rendering the original component and adding some props on top of it, you actually provide the original component as a property to the component that adds some functionality on it, and that extra component actually renders the original component and provides some extra variables to it. So this has the advantages of the old approaches, but many people think that this is even better because it provides that more explicit that it's more explicit what you're actually using in your component. And the support for higher order components and render props is full since maybe even the first versions of React, because it's really not something special in React. We're just using components for another piece of functionality. So you can probably use it in your projects even if they are a bit old. And there is pretty good documentation on the website too. So my examples will be available for you to see if you want to try out creating these higher order components or render props. But if you go to React's documentation, they have pretty good examples there as well. So this is pretty much it. What I wanted to show you today. Don't use Mixins because they're not recommended. But they're not explicitly removed from React, which is an interesting thing actually. Yeah. So either higher order components or render props. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz.
Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, I think we have for sure.
Sure.
So
Go ahead.
So have you used pre-compose for higher order components?
No, I haven't. Not yet.
Okay, and any testing strategies for higher order components?
I actually think they're pretty easy to test because you can put in any kind of component you want inside of it. So you can isolate that extra functionality in a test. So I think they're pretty decent. Mixins were decent as well because they were just objects. And render props, quite easy too, because you can put in a function instead of a component inside the prop that is rendered by the component that adds extra functionality on top of the original.
And do you have any preference over render props or higher order components? Because I'm looking at this, and here you do have just a header that is rendered, but if you had like a huge form with fields, that would look ugly to me.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think most of the time you'll be using higher order components. I had a problem once in one of the more complicated projects that I did where I had to use render props because they're dynamic. But other than that, you should be okay with using higher order components. What Facebook had a problem with was that they had a lot of functionality on top of components, and it just became very difficult for them to understand how components work at some point. And people were afraid to change code because of that. And so this is another solution to that. This is more explicit. If you can't figure out what's going on, then this might be the way to go. But what I do, I try to use higher order components first. And if that doesn't work, then I use render props instead.
Okay, and when you use higher order components, I saw that you spread the props as the last thing. Do you do it as the last or as the first?
Well,
Because I do it as the first to make sure that the props get passed from the higher order component, and it's probably easier to chase which is overwriting another one. I'm wondering if you have more experience probably, so.
well, that's an interesting question. I think that the official documentation does what I did. So
Okay.
the spread is after the extra props. But either way, you'll have a problem if the names of the props are the same. So I'm not sure which one is easier to debug, actually. I'm not sure. Fortunately, the